Hello, thanks for joining us once again for another edition of Spiritism, a closer look at evolution. Once again, this happens every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time via Kardec Radio. I'm Luis Lima, and welcome to our program number 13. We discussed last week about the races, how incarnated spirits came aboard and how the races distribution happened throughout the ages. So at the end, as we always do, we bring a question, the spirit trivia. So let's see what the question was for this last week. Let's try to address it. And don't forget, you can always go to evolution.spirittrivia.com. You're going to see a question posted every week. Just participate with us, cast your answer. And let's take a look at last week's question. That was last week's question. Which of the following exiles from Capella had fewer moral debts than the others? So we have 5 options here: Hindu, Americans, Celts, Egyptians, and Hebrews. And if you remember what we discussed, the answer is Egyptians. So for all of you who cast your answers, letter D, Egyptians, you got that right. They were the ones that came from Capella. They were among those that came from Capella to Earth. They were exiles. They were the most advanced ones. They had fewer moral debts than all the others. So that is the correct answer, Egyptians. That was from last week when we spoke about races. This week, we're gonna look at the intelligent principle in a lot more details. We have mentioned the intelligent principle in the beginning of our meetings, probably on meeting number 2 and 3. And we brought over this image here. We don't have the animation on the image because the animation is, it takes time to run it. So we just wanted to refresh our mind with this picture. And we were, on this picture, we speak about the vital principle, okay, the appearance of the vital principle, and that's when the intelligent principle is going to start its evolutionary journey, going through all the plants kingdom and the animal kingdom and humans as well. Okay, so today, here on this image, we briefly mentioned that we spoke a kind of an overview of how things happen. Today, we want to take the time and look at this with a different angle, a lot more details. Let's just zoom in and look at this thing. So life starts with the plants kingdom, as we saw, and it starts with the most simplest forms of bacteria. And like I said, the intelligent principle is going to start manipulating, per se, or using vital principle to go through all the kingdoms, starting with the bacteria. Okay, let's speak a little bit about each one of them as we go along. Bacteria. So we see here 3 notes about the bacteria: asexual reproduction, prokaryote cells, and species invariability. All right, what is prokaryote cells? These are cells that have no nucleus. No nucleus. So all human cells, for example, all of them, they have nucleus. Prokaryote cells do not. So those are the first type of cells, the first type of living organisms on Earth. And also, because they don't have a nucleus, they don't have what today we know as DNA, right? All the chromosomes and DNAs. So if there is no DNA, there is no variability within the species. All the individuals are the same. There's no one different than the other. So those are the main characteristics of those bacteria in the very beginning of life, the primitive forms of life. From the bacteria, we go to something that's called leptothrix. Leptothrix is a differentiated, still a bacteria, but it's a differentiated type of bacteria for one very interesting reason. You got to remember, here life is still underwater. There is no life on land still. Life is still all under the oceans and underwater. So what if you think about the sea, right? You have rocks and the water moving, and the water hits the rocks, and that's that's life under the sea, basically. These bacteria, they have some sort of protection, some sort of casing, right, around them. And this casing is made of iron. Iron is, it can be found in the rocks under the sea. So the leptothrix, they use that to protect themselves. And what happens is, at times, they lose the casing, the iron casing, all of them, because, the water hits and there's movement of water, and they hit the rocks. And at times, the iron casing just breaks and they are unprotected. So what happens is they bind together. They bind together to protect one another. That's an interesting concept, right? That's a kind of a very, very, very primitive type of mutual attraction, if you will, right? On the basis that one organism needs protection to survive, and that protection can come from another organism living with them. So very interesting thing. Leptothrix, mutual attraction. From the leptothrix, the next thing that's the next important point, or the next important jump, I would say, is called green algae. The algae, as we know, are still primitive forms of life. They are an evolutionary leap from the leptothrix. One interesting thing here is science acknowledges the existence of leptothrix. They acknowledge the existence of green algae, but the transition from one to another is kind of a very gray area. There's this huge question mark. It's not really clear from the scientific point of view, the academic science, how things could have happened. There's no indication. It looks like there's a missing link, if you will, in here, in passing from the leptothrix to the green algae. Anyhow, remember, leptothrix, mutual attraction, green algae, which is the next level up. Then we see the first signs of what we are going to call one day, way down the road, sexual communion. That's the first essays, the first idea of that. And also a very important thing is the appearance of the cellular membrane. So cells are now well-defined, the boundaries are well-defined, they have a form, a membrane around anything, around a form, right? It gives form, it gives shape. So that appears with the green algae. And interesting things happen here before we can go to the next level. Green algae, they will bring the first, it's the prelude of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, when the plant acquires sun rays and produces oxygen, it starts right here. Another interesting thing about the green algae is the flagellate. They are able, they have these little tiny thin legs, if you will, right? Using a human word for that. So they can move around. That they get the ability to move around. Thing that prior to them, there wasn't such a thing. They were just being bounced around by the sea and the rocks. And now they acquire what's going to be a leg in the very future. Okay. With that ability, the ability to move around and have its own ability to go where you want to go, life will be taken from the sea to the land. Now it makes sense to move into the land because you have the ability to, you have the proper apparatus to be able to move out of the seas, out of the water, into the land. So the ability to move around and take life out from the sea into the land appears right here. And the first forms of life in the land are, you still have muddy waters and stuff like that. But think about this. When these organisms go to the land, when they get out of the waters and go to the land, they still need water to survive, because that was what they needed to survive. Oxygen is in water. They needed that. When they jump out of the sea into the land, they don't have that anymore, but they need it. So what happens is they develop some sort of what today we call the roots of a plant. So it's kind of, they tap into the muddy waters all the way down until they are able to find water and suck from that, and that will get them going. So that replace the idea, the appearance of the roots in the plant, right, will provide what these organisms need to live on the land, but still have access to water for their feeding purposes, okay, and their survival. Later on, when these forms of life go to less muddy waters, to less grass-like, they will develop what a sap feeding system. A sap feeding system. Still, they need to bring the water that's in the land. They need to be able to suck that water, but they develop a sapping system, and later on they will have a more stable posture with stem and everything else. So the entire plants kingdom starts from this. This is very important, very interesting, also explained to us by Spiritism. Anyway, let's get going. Okay, so green algae. From the green algae, we go to the next step, next level, which are the colloids. Colloids, it comes from the Latin word for gluing things. Okay, so you can glue things. What are we gluing? Cells. We are able to, the intelligent, this is all developed, by the way, this is all orchestrated by the intelligent principle. You learned how to do that. You learned how to, jump from the primitive bacteria into the leptothrix and then into the green algae. Then now that it knows how to operate that matter, that organic matter, you will go to the next level, which is to bind unicellular organisms together, to glue them. And that's what we know as colloids. So the organisms are going to start to be larger, bigger. Okay, so a few words about colloids. It's a new combination of chemical elements that the intelligent principle learned. Intelligent principle is always learning, always, always, always. That's why it needs to go through all these steps, because it's a never-ending learning curve, if you will. So a new combination, by learning how to combine new chemical elements and substances, the intelligent principle is able to create larger particles. And these assure that there's better agglutination, because now I know how to operate substances that agglutinate. The bond is firmer. It's a stronger bond. And that will produce what we call colloids. Okay. After the colloids, the organisms are getting bigger. So instead of one cell now, we have multi-cell organisms getting larger and larger. So we need some sort of control, because otherwise what we're going to have is just a mass of cells, and and there's no control. You cannot really form an organism. You need to produce a form, a shape. And that's where the chromosomes come in place. These chromosomes are made of proteins. They are strings of proteins that initially are going to help these colloids to acquire a certain form. Okay, so Andre Luiz tells us in his book, Evolution in Two Worlds, that chromosomes are special fluidic magnetic concentrations. Very interesting, his point of view. He's looking at this from the other side of life. So special fluidic magnetic concentration. Very interesting. And with the advent of the chromosome, everything is set to hold information about the process of reproduction. And that's when the genes come on board. The genes are part of the chromosomes that define how the reproduction process is going to take place. Genes, if you think about it, they guarantee immortality of the cells, because when one cell dies, we have the recipe, or there is a recipe for another one exactly like the first one to be created. So that carries the general idea of immortality of the cell. Okay, we reproduce, we duplicate cells exactly as they were before originally. And with the genes, something new also appears, individualization, because now genes can be different for different organisms, for different species. We can have different types of plants. We can, within the same family of plants, meaning they're very similar, still there are differences among them. Okay, so this is the prelude of genetics right here. Starts right here when chromosomes and genes come on board right after the colloids. Then we go into the plants kingdom. Okay, plants, again, we saw that everything starts with the green algae, and now we're going to go to larger plants. So we go into grass, fungi, and different things, right? Important information about the plants. Differentiation according to each species, and that can happen now because they have genes, they have chromosomes and genes. So it is possible now to create or to shape life in different forms. Okay. Also, there's an incorporation of the physiological automatisms, and this is going to be important from here there on. For example, on us humans, okay, when you digest something, you don't need to stop everything that you're doing, put your hands up and say, hey, stop because I'm digesting food. No, it's an automated process. It just happens. Your heart beats not because you're stop. I'm going to make my heart beat now. Oh, okay, it did. Again, it did. We don't do this anymore. It's an automated process. So automation is something, any functionality on our body that is automated, it's really automated in our perispirit, but it comes from earlier forms of life. And that's why we're going through this thing. So all of this history here that the intelligent principle is collecting, because it's learning and by trial and error, all of this, of course, with the concourse of the superior spirits, but all of this is going to be part of the spiritual history on the intelligent principle. So the idea of automatisms starts with the plants, the inferior, the lower plants. The higher plants are plants that have a lot more complex organisms in comparison to the other plants, especially to the algae. They will, of course, by the time we get to higher plants, there are a lot of species, a lot of differentiation between them, but interesting information about them. They are sensitive to light, to sound, to chemical substances, to vibration and touch. And this is scientifically proved. We have experiments and several, by the way, several experiments that address this. And there's a general agreement within the academic science that this is a fact now. It's no longer a theory, it's a fact. Now, very interesting, there is communication with one plant to another using voltage variations on the membrane. So there is communication. One interesting form of communication is corn, right? Corn, for example, if you go back several hundred years ago, corn, when you have a corn plant here, okay, you cannot have another one very close. They repulse. They don't like each other. They don't like proximity. So if you think about the economics of planting corn, it would be a disaster because You're gonna, in between plants, you're gonna have a lot of area that cannot be used. So if you think in terms of economy, that's not good, because the farmers are kind of, if you will, losing money. They could use the land better. They could have more plants per square meter, per square feet. They could make more money. So what happens is, in around 1978, we were able to modify genetically corn. That's what we call GMO, genetically modified organism. So we were able to do this and work on the genetics of the plant. So the one corn plant is not going to send another signal to another one saying, you're too close, get away. So corn today, when you look at a cornfield, for example, the plants, each one of them, they are very close. The wasted land, per se, wasted in terms of economy, is minimum. That's because we were able to address this, because they send signals to another one, right? Very interesting, right, people? Okay, so we go into the animals. We are going to speak within the animals kingdom next week. We're going to detail this. So just in a few words, general words, with the animal kingdom, something takes place that was never before, which is the size of the organisms. Andre Luiz, in his book Evolution in Two Worlds, he tells us we go from the annelids to these gigantic animals, monstrous forms that had to live and die and disappear, because these were experiments from the spiritual plan in working towards human life, towards life that could receive, that could be orchestrated by a more advanced intelligent principle when that was happening. So like dinosaurs 65 million years ago, those are considered these monstrous forms that lived, died, and disappeared completely. With time, again, we're going to do a little more detail next week on the animals. But with time, several species are born. So they are being established one by one. That's the fixation of this species. Hormones start to appear. And these are still present in our days. It gets transferred over to the next kingdom, which is the human kingdom, us. And two things, we're going to speak about those in detail next week. Hemoglobin, that's in the blood. The blood circulation becomes an important element within the body. And the pineal gland. Okay, the pineal gland is in the fishes, it's in reptiles. So that's something to detail for next week. After the animals, if you remember, what comes? The anthropoids, which are these, it's more than an ape and less than a man. It's in between. It's a transition point. It's the very primitive form of human life. It's right at the boundary. So within the anthropoids family, some important things that we should concentrate on. First, the evolution of the structure, the body structure, meaning each cell, okay, it gets a better functionality. The cells are more complex, elaborated in its nucleus and the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is everything that is not the nucleus. It's around the nucleus. So all the organelles inside the cytoplasm and the DNA into the nucleus, this is all, I would say, more developed than it was in the animal kingdom. Also, the instinct that starts in the animal kingdom gets a boost. Sexual instinct gets a boost in the anthropoids. If you go back to the animal kingdom, sex is not really what it is for us. They had mating periods. They had mating seasons. We don't have that. We don't have mating seasons. The sexual instinct is constantly alive in anthropoids, and it will be passed along to humans. So then we come along, humans, right? Okay, humans, two things we want to mention today. First of all, The intellectual development. There's a tremendous difference in terms of intellect from the animals and the anthropoids to modern day men. We discussed this a couple of weeks ago, how this transition happens. We had the Neanderthal men, or the Neanderthal physical type, and there was some sort of a, using a modern term, there was an upgrade to the DNA, and what we have today is a Cro-Magnon, and these are a leap from the Neanderthal. For example, compared to Neanderthal, we have, our brain is 4 times bigger. We have a lot more neurons. The whole, anything that is related to the brain and intelligence in general is much more developed here than in the anthropoids. And in the humans, something really interesting takes place. The appearance of the neocortex. Neocortex is an area of the brain responsible for creativity. For example, let me give an example. Anything that an animal can do in terms of brain, we can do. For example, the animal knows how to roar. They know how to bark, right? We do the same thing. We can as well. But there are things that we can do, they cannot. For example, play piano. They cannot, because it needs creativity. It needs something else in the brain that a dog doesn't have, that a monkey doesn't have. You see, you can teach a monkey to reproduce what the pianists do. It would take time, but it's possible. So the monkey, let's say the ape, they would play that one song, let's say 1 minute of a song exactly like the pianist, put it to the extreme. But that's the only thing he can do. He cannot play. If you tell the monkey or the ape, well, I'm tired of this song, play another song, it's not going to happen, because it needs creativity. Creativity comes from the neocortex. That starts with humans, starts with us. Animals don't have that. That's a big differentiation between us and them. And then within a human kingdom, we go into modern life, and we can tell, if you read a little bit about history, or if we know about history, if you go back, let's say 500 years, not that long, consider the entire history of humanity. So if we go 500 years ago, the type of question that they had in those days is completely different than ours. Their target was different. Their purposes and objectives were different. We have new questions. We see a new reality. We were able to get to, especially in technology or in science, we were able to get to a point where they could not even dream 500 years ago. Something so great that we have today, some of them are unthinkable 50 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. It's incredible how things go fast. So that brings to us, modern life, new challenges. So our quest is different. Our questions are different. Our purpose, it is another challenge. Things have changed. Things have really changed. And why all these changes? Why all of this? Because it is the purpose of God that the intelligent principle develops, gets better, learns more, and advances intellectually, physically, and morally. And that's exactly what's happening here. That's why all these things. Okay. All right. To wrap up today's meeting, one phrase that is in this book by Spirit Andre Luiz, in the greater world. This is what it says. The entire neural organization. What is that? Neural, brain, and the nervous system, right? That entire organization of the individual represents the perispiritual powers that have been gradually gained by the spirit over many millennia. which is more or less what we did here. We took all this time from the get-go, from the primitive, earlier forms of life and bacteria and all of that. We went through, of course, we do this in 30 minutes, but that's the idea. Everything that took place because the intelligent principle is learning. It is acting upon organic matter to learn more, to do more, to get better. Well, so for next week, we wanted to take a look, put a magnifier on the animal kingdom. We're going to go into details, study a few things that are very interesting. We're going to see within the animal kingdom the evolution of the body in general, parts of the human system. Very interesting. So I invite you to follow along and be with us next week. Don't miss it. Don't miss it, because I really encourage you to participate. And by talking about participating, don't forget to cast your answer for this week's Spirit Trivia. Just go to evolution.spirittrivia.com. If you're watching us from your computer, you can just click on the top left of your screen where you see the QR code. Just go there. And once again, I always like to reinforce that we do not collect any information from you. We do not ask you for an email. It's totally 100% anonymous. No email, no IP address, no anything. We don't collect anything. We do not ask you for anything. Just participate with us, cast your answer, and again, we'll be here next week to discuss the answers and study a little bit more about Spiritism, a closer look, evolution. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.